Best she was beaten and abused for 3 years by white men, until I heard her forbidden cry. The morning sun barely touched the windows of the small old house where she lived, but it was enough to cast long, trembling shadows across the room. Every corner seemed filled with whispers of the past, echoes of fear that clung to the walls like a thick, heavy fog. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the floor as if it held all the answers to her life. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside, a sound that once might have been comforting, but now seemed distant, almost unreachable. She had learned long ago that silence was both a shield and a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the broken window, reminded her of the life she had been forced to endure, a life built on hiding, on pretending, on surviving one small moment at a time. She remembered when it had all started. At first it was just small things, sharp words, sudden anger, warnings that she should stay quiet. She had thought she could manage, that the fear would pass, that somehow she could make the world stop noticing her pain. But the fear never passed. It grew, day by day, filling her like water in a slowly sinking ship. She learned how to move without making noise, how to speak in whispers, how to pretend that everything was fine even when her heart was breaking. There were times when she would sit alone at night, listening to the sound of her own breathing, convincing herself that if she stayed still, if she stayed quiet, the world would not notice her, and for years it had worked for it. Outside, life moved on. People went to work, laughed with friends, and returned home with stories to tell. G had no stories to tell, no one to greet her with warm words, no one to notice that she had become almost invisible. The people in the neighborhood saw her sometimes, walking quickly to the corner store, keeping her eyes down, pretending to be just another face in the crowd. They never knew the battles she fought within the walls of that house. They never knew the nights she spent awake, listening, waiting, praying that tomorrow might bring even the smallest glimmer of hope. Her family had tried to help long ago. She remembered the conversations, the quiet suggestions, the worried looks that said more than words ever could. But she had learned not to burden them. She had learned that no one could truly understand what it was like to live every day in fear, to count each hour by the moments when you were safe and the moments when you were not. And so she stayed, keeping the secrets locked tightly in her heart, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, carrying the weight of her pain alone. She had her own ways of surviving. She kept a small notebook hidden under the mattress, a place where she could write the thoughts that had no voice. The pages were filled with words that no one would ever read, words that described not just the fear but also the tiny sparks of hope that refused to die. Sometimes she would write about dreams she had once had, dreams of traveling, of learning, of laughter that came freely, without fear. Other times she would write about the moments when she had felt a strange kind of strength, when she realized that even in the darkest times she had survived. The notebook became her companion, a silent witness to the life that the world did not see. The mornings were always the hardest. Each day began with the weight of yesterday pressing down on her chest, reminding her that the struggle would continue. But in the quiet moments before the world stirred, she found a small comfort in routine. She would make a cup of tea, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers, letting the steam rise into her face, like a small, fragile hope. But she would listen to the faint sounds of life outside, allowing herself to imagine a world where she could move freely, where she could speak without fear, where she could breathe without the constant shadow of worry. These moments were brief, but they were hers, a reminder that even in a life filled with pain, small pieces of freedom could exist. The fear had taught her many things. It had taught her to be careful, to notice the smallest details, to anticipate the slightest change in mood or tone. She could read the room like a map, knowing which paths were safe and which were dangerous. She had learned how to blend into the background, how to make herself invisible when needed. But it had also taught her about the strength she had, the courage that lived quietly in her heart. Crying, she realized that surviving each day required not just caution, but also a quiet kind of bravery that few could understand. Each small victory, each moment of control, became a testament to her endurance. Despite everything, there were moments when the world seemed almost normal. She would catch sight of children playing outside, laughing freely without a care in the world, and a pang of longing would twist in her chest. She remembered what it was like to feel safe, to trust, to dream without fear. And in those moments, she allowed herself to imagine that one day she might have that life again. She imagined walking through a sunlit park, hearing her own laughter mingling with the wind, feeling the warmth of the sun without the shadow of worry following her. These were the dreams she clung to, the visions that kept her moving forward when the world felt unbearably dark. Sometimes she would talk to herself softly, barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves could offer protection. You are strong. You are safe. You can make it. The words felt fragile, almost too small for the enormity of her life. But they were powerful. They reminded her that despite everything, she had survived. She had faced darkness and continued to breathe, to think, to hope. Each day she woke up and faced another set of challenges, another test of endurance. She proved to herself that she could exist beyond the fear that tried to define her. Breakings. She often thought about the future, though it seemed distant and uncertain. She dreamed of leaving the old house behind, of stepping into a world where no one could control her, where her voice could be heard without fear. Brain. She imagined meeting people who would see her for who she truly was, not the frightened, silent version she had learned to become. She imagined a life filled with ordinary joys, walking in the park, sharing a meal with friends, laughing until her chest ached. These thoughts gave her a quiet strength, a reminder that life was not just pain and fear, that there was something more waiting for her beyond the walls that confined her. Even in the hardest moments, she found small ways to resist, perhaps of his business. She learned to take care of herself in the ways she could. Small acts of defiance, moments of self-care that reminded her that she mattered. She would brush her hair with care, cook simple meals for herself, or play soft music that made her heart feel lighter for a while. These acts were simple, almost insignificant, but they were powerful symbols of her refusal to be completely consumed by the darkness. They reminded her that even in captivity, even in fear, she still had choices, and she still had a life that was hers, even if only in fragments. The days were long, filled with uncertainty and tension, but she met each one with quiet determination. She had learned that survival required patience, observation, and an unbroken will. She had become a master of small victories, of hidden strengths that no one could see. And though the years had left their marks on her body, on her mind, on her spirit, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, a knowledge that she had endured more than most could imagine. And so she waited, day after day, for something she could not fully define. It was not just freedom she longed for, but the possibility of a life where she could feel whole again. A life where she could speak without fear, laugh without restraint, and dream without boundaries. She held on to this hope quietly, as if even thinking about it too loudly might shatter it. It was fragile, delicate, but it was hers. And for now, it was enough to keep her alive, to keep her moving through the long shadows of each day, toward a future that might one day bring her the light she had almost forgotten existed. She moved through the day like a shadow, careful not to disturb the world around her. The streets outside were busy with people rushing to work or school, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm she could almost feel, but could never join. She watched them sometimes, standing behind a cracked window, imagining what it might feel like to walk among them freely, to smile without fear, to speak without hesitation. For years she had hidden behind masks. The mask of calm, the mask of politeness, the mask of someone ordinary. and each one weighed heavily on her, as if the effort to survive was carved into her very bones. At times she wondered if anyone truly noticed her. There were neighbors who waved politely, a cashier at the corner store who smiled briefly, but no one really looked. They only saw what she allowed them to see, a quiet, seemingly normal young woman who kept to herself and never caused trouble. Behind the smiles and the politeness, however, was a life built entirely on careful observation, on knowing which words to speak and which to swallow, on learning how to bend without breaking breaths. Each day was a delicate dance, a test of patience and awareness, and even the smallest misstep could have consequences she had long learned to fear. Her friends, or rather acquaintances she could barely call friends, were another part of the world she had learned to navigate carefully. At school and work, she smiled, laughed at the right moments, and shared stories that were mostly invented, carefully crafted to maintain the illusion that her life was ordinary. Inside, her thoughts were a different story. She replayed every word, every gesture, over and over again in her mind, analyzing what could have gone wrong, what might have triggered anger, what could have drawn attention in ways she wanted to avoid. Each interaction, no matter how small, was a potential risk, and she had learned to move through them with caution and precision. There were days when the weight of her hidden life seemed almost unbearable. She would sit quietly in a corner of her room, listening to the faint noises from the street outside, wishing for someone to see through the carefully maintained mask. Sometimes she imagined confiding in someone, speaking aloud all the thoughts and fears she had kept buried for years. But the thought terrified her as much as it comforted her. Trust was a dangerous thing, a fragile object that could shatter with the slightest mistake. And so she kept her words to herself, letting only the small notebook under her mattress carry the truth she could not share. The notebook was her confidant, her secret companion. It was filled with scribbles and notes that told her story in a way no one else could understand. Pages described memories of better times, fleeting moments when she had felt safe or happy. Others captured the fear that never left her, the constant awareness of eyes that might be watching, voices that might be waiting. She wrote not just to remember, but to survive, to remind herself that even though the world had tried to silence her, she still had a voice. The act of writing, even in secret, gave her a sense of control she had learned was rare and precious. Despite the careful masks she wore, there were subtle signs that something was not right. Occasionally, her coworkers or neighbors would notice her flinch at sudden movements or the way she avoided certain topics in conversation. They might see her hands tremble when she thought no one was watching, or the distant look in her eyes that spoke of battles they could not understand. People often interpreted these signs in their own ways: stress, anxiety, shyness. But no one saw the full truth. The full story was hidden beneath layers of silence and survival, and only she knew the courage it took simply to exist from one day to the next. Sometimes the pressure built to an almost unbearable level. On quiet nights she would pace the room, letting the tension roll off her like a storm she could not escape. She thought about escape, about running to a place where no one could control her, no one could hurt her. She planned routes in her mind, imagined conversations she might have, rehearsed words she could speak if anyone would listen, but the fear was always there, whispering that even small mistakes could lead to disaster. She had learned the hard way that freedom was not given lightly, and that every step toward it had to be taken with extreme caution. She also had moments of connection, rare and precious. There was the elderly neighbor who sometimes offered a kind word, the shopkeeper who remembered her favorite snack, the co-worker who smiled in passing. These small gestures were like glimpses of sunlight breaking through the clouds, brief reminders that the world held kindness even when it seemed out of reach. Each tiny act of warmth gave her hope, even if only for a few moments, and reminded her that she was not completely invisible, that there were people who might notice if she allowed herself to be seen. Her thoughts often returned to the past, to the life she had before everything changed. She remembered laughter, sunlight, friends, and freedom, things that now seemed almost like distant dreams. Those memories were bittersweet, bringing both comfort and pain, reminding her of what she had lost and what she longed to regain.
And yet, in recalling those memories, she found a quiet strength.
She realized that the person she had been, the person who had known joy and light, was still alive inside her. That part of herself had survived, and it was that inner spark that would guide her forward when the world felt darkest. There were also moments when she tested herself. Small acts of courage that no one else knew about. Sometimes she would leave the house for a short walk, taking care to stay in public spaces and avoid any risk. Sometimes she would make a phone call she had been too afraid to make before, speaking to a friend or family member in brief coded words that conveyed more than they seemed to. Breaths. Each act was small, almost invisible, but each one was a step toward reclaiming her life, a quiet rebellion against the control that had defined her for so long. Her inner life was rich, filled with imagination and careful planning. He created stories in her mind where she was free, safe, and strong, stories that allowed her to escape the reality of her life for a little while. In those stories, she walked without fear, spoke without hesitation, and lived without the constant shadow of worry. These imagined worlds were not just escape. They were training grounds, rehearsals for the courage she would one day need to face the real world. They reminded her that even if the present was dark, the future could still hold light. She also learned to read people, to notice the smallest details that might reveal intentions or emotions. A glance, a tone of voice, the way someone shifted in their seat. She learned to interpret these signals with precision. This awareness kept her safe in the past and continued to guide her through the present. It was a skill born of necessity, one that she carried with her in every interaction, a silent tool that allowed her to navigate a world that often felt threatening. Yet even in her careful observation and quiet routines, the desire for something more persisted. She wanted connection, understanding, and freedom. She longed for a day when she could laugh freely, when her voice could be heard without fear, when her thoughts could spill into the world without restraint. That longing was a quiet fire that burned steadily inside her, giving her the strength to face each day and the courage to plan for a future she hoped would one day come. And so she moved through her life in careful steps, balancing fear and hope, caution and courage. Each day was a challenge. But each day also brought small victories, moments of insight, brief connections, tiny steps toward freedom. The world outside continued its rhythm, unaware of the life unfolding in shadows behind the windows of the small old house. Yet she persisted, surviving in ways that no one else could fully understand, holding on to a vision of life that might one day be hers. The story of her hidden life was not one of surrender, but of endurance, of quiet strength, of a determination that refused to be extinguished. She had survived years of fear and isolation, carrying herself with dignity despite the weight of her circumstances. And even though the future remained uncertain, she had learned that survival was not just about enduring the present. It was about nurturing the hope that one day she could step into the light, and her voice would finally be heard. The afternoon sun poured through the cracks in the old curtains, casting long stripes of light across the floor. Day. She sat quietly in the corner of the room, her hands clasped tightly together, staring at the floor as if it held some secret solution to the troubles that had shadowed her life for years. The world outside continued to move in its usual rhythm, unaware of the small, fragile life existing behind the walls of the old house. But inside, something was stirring, a shift she had not felt in a long time. A small spark, faint and fragile, began to flicker in her heart, and with it came a daring thought she had never allowed herself to entertain. Maybe, just maybe, someone could hear her. It had been years since she had dared to imagine a life beyond the fear and the walls that confined her. For so long her world had been measured by the smallest rules, the tiniest adjustments, and the constant vigilance that allowed her to survive. Every word spoken, every glance, every movement had been calculated carefully to avoid anger or notice. But now, as she sat alone, the weight of her silence pressed on her with an intensity that could no longer be ignored. She realized that the voice she had kept buried for so long had not disappeared. It was still there, whispering, urging her to take the first step toward freedom. The first time it happened, it was barely audible. She had been leaning against the cracked window frame, watching the world outside, when a thought struck her so sharply it nearly made her gasp aloud.
She could not continue like this forever.
The life she had endured, the years of hiding, the fear that had been her constant companion, it had to end. But speaking was dangerous. She knew that even the smallest sound could be risky, that she could be overheard and punished in ways she had learned to fear deeply. And yet the desire to be heard, the need to let someone know she existed beyond the silence, was stronger than her fear. She pressed her hands to her chest and whispered, just barely, "Help." The word trembled in the room, almost lost in the quiet hum of the day. She felt an immediate rush of fear, imagining someone had heard it, imagining consequences she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. But then came the realization that she had said it. She had let the sound escape. For the first time in years, she had taken a step toward herself, toward the possibility of being seen. The fear was still there, yes, but it was mingled now with a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Hope. A small, fragile hope that perhaps someone, somewhere, could hear her. In the days that followed, she found herself testing the boundaries of her voice. At first, it was only whispers, barely audible even to herself. She would speak into the corners of her room, words that described her life, her thoughts, her dreams, and her fears. It was like breathing for the first time after being underwater, a small, cautious release of something vital she had been holding in for years. The act of speaking, even in solitude, began to fill her with a quiet strength. Each word she allowed herself to utter reminded her that she still existed, that she had not been completely swallowed by the silence that had defined her life. She also began to pay closer attention to the world outside. The rhythm of the neighborhood, the way people moved through the streets, the sounds that came through the windows. All of it became a map, a guide that might help her navigate the first steps toward real freedom. She listened for the softest noises, footsteps approaching the house, voices drifting from open windows, the laughter of children playing nearby. Each sound became a piece of information, a clue to the possibilities and dangers that might await her beyond the walls she had never left. One afternoon, as she was speaking softly to herself about a life she longed to have, a small voice answered back. It was not a voice she had imagined, but a real one, belonging to someone who had been quietly observing the world around the house for weeks. A kind and careful presence, someone who had sensed that all was not as it seemed behind the old walls. The voice was cautious, gentle, and almost hesitant, as if testing the waters of her silence. "Are you okay?" it asked. Rasp. She froze, heart pounding, unsure if it was real, unsure if she had imagined it. And then, slowly, cautiously, she whispered back, breaths. "I need help." The words were small, fragile, but they carried a weight that had been missing from her life for years. The voice on the other side responded with warmth and patience, giving her a sense of safety she had not known existed. It asked questions, gentle and non-intrusive, allowing her to share as much as she felt comfortable with. She spoke in whispers, revealing pieces of her life, her fears, and her longing for freedom. Each word was a tiny victory, each sentence a step toward reclaiming a voice that had been silenced for too long. Even as she began to open up, the fear remained. Every sound in the house, every unexpected movement, reminded her that danger was always present. But now, for the first time, she had someone listening. Someone who believed her without judgment. Someone who offered the possibility that her life could change. That belief, quiet and steady, became a lifeline. It reminded her that she was not alone, that survival was not just about hiding and enduring, but also about daring to reach out, to risk being seen, to let the world into her life. She also began to notice small changes in herself. The simple act of speaking, even softly, made her feel lighter, more connected to the world beyond the walls. Her thoughts became clearer, her plans more precise, her hope more tangible. But she began to imagine the future not as a distant dream, but as a series of steps she could take, each one bringing her closer to safety, freedom, and the life she had longed for. The fear was still there, of course, but it no longer dominated her thoughts entirely. Now it was balanced by courage, by determination, by the knowledge that she could take control of her story. At night, she would lie awake thinking about the day's events, replaying conversations, imagining the steps she would take next. Sometimes the memory of the first whispered word, the first hint of being heard, brought tears to her eyes. She realized that speaking, even in secret, had begun to change her. It had begun to remind her of her own strength, of her own resilience, of the part of herself that had survived years of fear and isolation. And in that realization, she found a new kind of courage, the courage to continue, to take the next steps, to believe that freedom was not just possible, but attainable. The world outside remained largely unaware of her struggles. People continued their routines, went about their lives, laughed, argued, and moved with the rhythm of ordinary days. But inside, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Burrow. She was no longer completely hidden, no longer entirely silenced. The small spark of courage had grown into a flicker of light, a promise that she might yet reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Raging despair. Each whispered word, each cautious step, was a building block, a preparation for the moment when she could fully break free and embrace the world beyond the walls. As the days passed, she began to plan more actively. She thought about the people who could help her, the routes she could take, the signals she might give. Every plan was careful, cautious, and precise, informed by the years of vigilance and observation that had kept her alive. She knew that escape was not simply a physical act. It required strategy, patience, and courage. But now, unlike before, she had a partner in her journey, someone who listened, believed, and provided guidance without judgment. That presence made all the difference, giving her the confidence to move from mere survival to deliberate action. She also began to recognize the value of small victories. A day spent speaking more openly, a successful attempt at a quiet walk outside, a moment of trust. These were victories, and they reminded her that change was possible. She began to measure time not just by survival but by progress, by the steps she took toward reclaiming her life. And with each step, she felt a little stronger, a little more confident, a little more certain that her voice, long hidden, could finally carry her toward the freedom she had dreamed of for so long. And so, the moment of the forbidden cry had arrived. It was not a loud, dramatic shout, but a careful, deliberate step toward being seen, toward being heard, toward reclaiming the self she had kept hidden for so long. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, a shift from silent endurance to cautious action. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of a life where fear did not dictate every word, every movement, every thought. The spark of hope had become a guiding light, and she knew that she would follow it, no matter how long or difficult the path might be. The morning was quiet, the kind of morning where the sunlight seemed softer, almost gentle, as if the world itself knew something was about to change. She woke with a strange mix of fear and anticipation, her heart beating fast, but not with the usual dread that had filled her for years. Today was different. Today she had made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. For the first time, she felt the courage to act, to take the step she had long imagined but never dared to follow. Her room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with memories and shadows, but she no longer felt trapped. Instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Every plan she had made in secret, every whispered conversation, every small victory of courage over fear had prepared her for this moment. She carefully gathered the few things she needed, small tokens of her life that she could carry with her, knowing that every item mattered in a world where even the smallest details could mean safety or danger. The presence of the kind voice, the listener who had reached out to her after the forbidden cry, gave her hope and guidance. They had exchanged careful, coded messages, plans that were precise, cautious, and filled with trust. That guidance reminded her that she was not alone. For years she had endured everything by herself. But now, for the first time, there was someone walking beside her, even if from a distance, who believed in her and supported her desire to be free. The first step outside her room was the hardest. Her legs trembled slightly, her hands shook, and her mind raced with both fear and anticipation. Psst. Each sound of the house seemed amplified, every creak of the floor a warning. She paused, took a deep breath, and reminded herself that she had prepared for this moment. She had imagined it countless times, planned it meticulously, and rehearsed every possibility. With careful steps, she moved toward the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, hope, and determination. Once she stepped into the hallway, the world felt larger and more alive than it had in years. The air seemed fresher, the light brighter, and the possibility of freedom tangible, Berth said. She moved quietly, listening for any sign of danger, but also aware that the path ahead was one she had chosen. Every step was deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid unnecessary attention while still moving her closer to the life she had longed for. The years of vigilance and careful observation served her now, guiding her through the space she had once seen as a cage. When she reached the front door, she paused again, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. This was the moment she had imagined so many times in her secret thoughts, the moment when she would finally step out of the shadows and into the world where help awaited her. "Hey!" She opened the door slowly, letting the sunlight wash over her, filling her with warmth and a sense of possibility she had not felt in years. It was a small act, yet monumental, a threshold she had crossed that separated the life of fear from the life of hope. The listener was waiting a short distance away, careful to remain unseen by anyone who might be near the house. When she saw them, a surge of relief and gratitude washed over her. She was not alone, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the support of another human being who understood the importance of this moment. Words were not needed at first. The presence alone was enough. Slowly she moved closer, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and courage. Every step was a confirmation that she was reclaiming control over her life, that she could move forward even after years of confinement. The journey away from the old house was cautious, deliberate, and filled with attention to every detail. She moved quickly when needed, quietly when necessary, always aware of her surroundings and guided by the presence of her helper. For the first time, she noticed things she had not been able to see before: the smell of fresh air, the sound of birds singing, the rustle of leaves in the wind. These simple observations were almost overwhelming, a reminder that the world outside was alive and waiting, and that she was no longer trapped within the walls of fear that had defined her for so long. As they walked, her companion spoke in quiet, encouraging tones, reminding her that each step was progress, each careful movement a testament to her courage. The words were gentle, not commanding, giving her the space to act independently while also knowing she was supported. She realized that this was not just a physical journey, but an emotional and psychological one as well. She was moving not only through space, but also through years of trauma, reclaiming her confidence, her voice, and her sense of self. Place. Far enough from the old house to feel secure, she finally allowed herself to pause and breathe. The relief was profound, a sensation she had almost forgotten existed. Tears filled her eyes, not of fear or sadness, but of release, of gratitude, and of the realization that she had survived. She had endured years of confinement, fear, and uncertainty, and now she had stepped into a world that offered the possibility of healing, safety, and freedom. Her first interactions with the authorities, carefully guided by her companion, were cautious but empowering. She spoke about her life in pieces, sharing what she could in a way that was safe and controlled. Round. Each word spoken aloud felt like a victory, a reclamation of the voice that had been silenced for so long. The people she met listened with patience and care, validating her experiences without judgment, offering practical help and reassurance that she was no longer alone in facing the challenges ahead. The next few days were filled with adjustments and new routines. She learned how to navigate her new surroundings, how to communicate openly, and how to begin trusting people again. Small tasks, like making a meal or walking through a safe neighborhood, were both ordinary and extraordinary, a reminder that life could once again include simple joys that had been denied to her. Every successful action strengthened her confidence, helping her realize that she could live independently and safely, and that the years of fear and isolation were not the end of her story. She also began the process of connecting with support networks designed to help people who had experienced similar hardships. Meeting others who understood her situation provided comfort and reassurance. She realized she was not alone, that there were communities and individuals who would listen, support, and empower her. These connections, built slowly and carefully, became pillars of strength, giving her a foundation upon which to rebuild her life. Even as she adjusted to this new reality, she felt a mixture of emotions: relief, joy, uncertainty, and lingering fear.
The transition from years of confinement to freedom was not simple or immediate, but each step forward was significant.
She reminded herself that healing was a process, one that required patience, courage, and self-compassion. She learned to celebrate small victories, to acknowledge the strength it took simply to exist in a world that was once threatening and now offered safety. As the days turned into weeks, she began to reflect more deeply on the journey she had undertaken. The experience had changed her, shaped her resilience, and strengthened her sense of self. Round and desperate, she realized that the years of fear had not destroyed her. Instead, they had revealed her courage, her endurance, and her capacity for hope. She began to imagine a future where she could pursue her dreams, build meaningful relationships, and live a life defined not by fear, but by freedom, purpose, and joy. The moment she truly understood that she was safe came quietly. It was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a series of small, consistent realizations. Waking up without immediate fear, laughing without hesitation, speaking her thoughts aloud without trembling. Each of these moments reinforced the truth she had longed to believe, that she could live fully, freely, and safely. She had crossed a threshold that once seemed impossible, moving from survival to life, from silence to voice, and from fear to hope. In this new phase, she also began to help herself heal emotionally. Therapy sessions provided a safe space to process her experiences, explore her feelings, and develop strategies for building a secure and empowered life. She learned that healing was not linear, that setbacks were part of growth, and that acknowledging her strength was as important as acknowledging her pain. These sessions reinforced the lessons she had learned through her own courage, that she was capable, resilient, and deserving of a life free from fear. Finally, she began to envision the future with hope, not just for herself, but also for others. She realized that her journey could inspire others, that her voice could serve as a reminder of courage and resilience. The small spark of bravery that had begun with a whisper had grown into a light strong enough to illuminate the path forward. She had survived, she had reclaimed her life, and she was beginning to imagine a world where she could thrive, not just exist. The first morning in her new life was quiet, but full of possibility. She woke to sunlight spilling across the room, warm and gentle, as if the world itself was welcoming her. For the first time in years, she did not wake with fear pressing on her chest. Instead, she felt a strange combination of relief, curiosity, and cautious excitement. The world beyond the walls she had known for so long seemed vast, alive, and waiting. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs in a way that reminded her she was truly alive, truly free.
Her first steps into each new day were deliberate.
She moved slowly, savoring the small joys that had once been denied to her. She made herself a simple breakfast, feeling the warmth of the cup in her hands and the softness of the bread she ate. These were ordinary acts, yet for her they were extraordinary. They reminded her that life could be gentle, safe, and nurturing, that she could care for herself without fear. Each action, no matter how small, was a reclaiming of control, a quiet statement that she was no longer trapped by the shadows of the past. She also began to explore the world outside with careful curiosity. Walks through parks, along quiet streets, and into safe neighborhoods became moments of discovery. She noticed things she had long forgotten. The way sunlight danced through leaves, the smell of flowers in bloom, the sound of laughter echoing from children at play. Every detail was vivid, a reminder that the world held beauty and life even after years of darkness. And each observation strengthened her belief that the life she had longed for was possible, waiting for her to step into it fully. One of the most important aspects of her healing was learning to speak openly about her experiences. She worked with trained counselors and support networks who helped her process the years of fear, silence, and endurance. Each session was both challenging and liberating, and she discovered that sharing her story, even in a safe environment, allowed her to release burdens she had carried alone for so long. Words that had once felt dangerous became tools of healing. Slowly, carefully, she reclaimed her voice, learning that it was powerful, valid, and deserving of being heard. The process was not without setbacks. There were days when memories of the past returned, bringing waves of sadness, anxiety, and even fear. She sometimes questioned whether she could truly live free, whether the years of fear had left marks too deep to heal. But on each of these days, she reminded herself of the steps she had already taken, the courage she had shown in surviving, and the support around her. She learned that healing was not a straight path, but a journey of persistence, self-compassion, and resilience. Each small victory over fear, each moment of courage, built the foundation of the empowered life she was creating. In the safety of her new environment, she began to nurture her interests and talents. She explored hobbies that had once seemed impossible: drawing, writing, or learning new skills. Each activity was a reminder of her creativity, intelligence, and capability, qualities that had survived years of suppression. She realized that her identity was more than the life she had endured. She was not just a survivor. She was a person with dreams, passions, and the potential to shape her own future. This realization became a source of joy and inspiration, helping her imagine a life filled with possibility rather than limitation. Connection with others became a vital part of her healing. She began to develop friendships based on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. These relationships provided companionship and support, reinforcing the lesson that she did not have to face the world alone. She learned to trust slowly, to share pieces of herself in a safe, measured way, and to accept kindness and care without fear.
Each successful interaction strengthened her confidence, teaching her that she could form healthy, nurturing bonds despite years of isolation and trauma.
She also found the courage to help others. Her story, once a source of fear and shame, became a tool to inspire and support those who had experienced similar struggles. Desperate networks shared her experiences in safe forums and offered encouragement to those still finding their way. Through this, she realized that her suffering had not been in vain. The resilience, courage, and empathy she had developed could now serve as a guiding light for others, transforming her past pain into a force for good. One of the most transformative aspects of her journey was reclaiming her sense of independence. She learned to make decisions for herself, to plan her days, and to navigate the world with confidence. No longer did fear dictate her movements or choices. She took pride in small acts of self-sufficiency, like preparing meals, handling personal errands, or setting goals for her future. Each act was a celebration of freedom, a tangible proof that she was capable, strong, and deserving of a life fully her own. She also nurtured her mental and emotional resilience. Daily practices of mindfulness, reflection, and gratitude helped her maintain balance and perspective. She recorded her thoughts and feelings in a new journal, noting achievements, hopes, and moments of courage. This practice became both a reflection of her journey and a guide for moving forward. By acknowledging her progress, she strengthened her belief in her own strength and reinforced the idea that her past did not define her future. Her dreams, once distant and fragile, began to take shape in practical ways. Breaths. She explored educational opportunities, career paths, and creative projects she had long postponed. Each step was deliberate, guided by careful planning and courage, and each success, no matter how small, reinforced her sense of self-worth and capability. She discovered that she could not only survive, but also thrive, creating a life shaped by her choices, passions, and goals rather than by fear. The emotional journey was equally important. Breaths. She allowed herself to feel fully, experiencing joy, laughter, and even sadness without judgment. She realized that emotional freedom was as vital as physical safety. Brace. She celebrated milestones, cherished ordinary moments, and allowed herself to imagine a future filled with meaningful experiences. This emotional growth helped her solidify a sense of identity separate from her past suffering, an identity grounded in strength, resilience, and self-compassion. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, she sat quietly reflecting on how far she had come. The girl who had once lived in fear, silence, and shadows had become a young woman of courage, voice, and hope. She remembered the long years behind the walls, the whispered cries for help, and the careful steps that had led her to freedom. And she realized that while those years had shaped her, they no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her future. She began to imagine not just surviving, but living fully. She thought about traveling, building relationships, creating art, and pursuing dreams that had seemed impossible before. She imagined a life where she could wake up with hope, speak without fear, and embrace each day with curiosity and courage. The possibility stretched before her like a wide-open road, filled with potential and promise. And she felt ready to walk that road, confident in her strength and her ability to navigate whatever challenges came her way. Finally, she understood that her journey was more than survival. It was transformation. She had endured fear, hardship, and isolation, and through that endurance, she had developed resilience, empathy, and courage. Private, she had learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And she had discovered that a life once constrained by shadows could now be filled with light, hope, and empowerment. In the quiet moments of reflection, she smiled to herself. The life she had longed for was no longer just a dream. It was real, built through courage, careful steps, and the support of those who believed in her. She had survived. She had grown. And she had transformed. Patient, she knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning, the first chapter of a life defined not by fear, but by hope, strength, and the limitless possibilities of freedom.